Thank you all for joining us for Chestnut Chat this morning. I am not Sarah Fitzsimmons. I am Kendra Collins, our Director of Regional Programs, filling in for Sarah today while she's in a meeting in DC. I'm really pleased to be hosting today and welcoming Fred Paillet to join us and talk about some of his observations and travels around Europe, looking at European chestnut and some of the ecology aspects of that species. I actually first became aware of Fred and his work when I was in grad school because I read a few of his papers. I think Fred, you're a geologist by trade, but chestnut ecology is a little bit more of more than a hobby, I would say. Quite knowledgeable about chestnut ecology as well. Fred is also an avid traveler, and I'm sure we could get him to talk about all kinds of places that he has been, but we're going to focus on those that have chestnuts for today. So. Again, bit of housekeeping. This is the webinar format for Zoom, so we can't see you, we can't hear you. Make as much noise as you would like. Listen in while you're eating your lunch. Your dog can bark as much as it wants. We won't hear it. If you have questions, put those in the Q&A, and Cassie and Catherine will be helping to answer some of those by typing things in if they're things that we aren't going to get to or that aren't really on topic for today. And we'll save as many of those we can for Fred to kind of answer as his presentation goes along, or we'll save them for the end. If you have just general commentary, feel free to throw that in the chat. As I mentioned, if you're just joining us, this is our 49th episode of Chestnut Chat. And we will be on to, we're going to skip next month because we're all quite busy in the field. And so July will be our 50th episode. I promise Sarah will be back to host that. I know it's always a little disappointing when you get the guest host and it's not who you were expecting. She's got some fun things up her sleeve for our 50th celebration of Chestnut Chat. So I hope you guys can join us then. And I think with that, Cassie, did I cover all the housekeeping?
I think so. Yeah.
Use everything. Yeah, I will turn it over to Fred, and I think they're supposed to just turn our cameras off so that he can have the stage. Thanks, Fred.
Okay, hopefully my PowerPoint will continue to cooperate. I guess I would classify myself as a chestnut tourist, and my chestnut journey started around 1980, where as a dirt and water geologist, I had colleagues who were trying to numerically pin down the climatic parameters for forest trees to take pollen data from the past and try and project it in terms of precipitation and moisture. And they ran into a kind of a roadblock when they came to chestnut, which is a major player in New England and the Appalachians, and yet there was no real data available. So I and my colleagues started to try and figure out what we could do to alleviate that. And I remember my first submitted chestnut publication in 1981 drew a reviewer response that said in one line, chestnut is dead and gone, who cares? And subsequently discovered that people really do care, and that's a pretty good thing. But that was my start in chestnut. I've had a chance to work and tour in a number of places in Europe, and that brought the opportunity to study European chestnut and simply observe it in its natural environment to try and figure out what's going on in parallel with American chestnut. While we're waiting for things to resolve themselves, you had asked me about Mount Etna, and that was one of the most interesting things I've seen anywhere in Europe, is to see a functioning wild chestnut forest that's able to produce a real crop of nuts and exclude all the competition, and yet still show obvious signs of blight in terms of dead branches and coppice trees. But this was at in the middle of September. The trees were just sagging under loads of chestnuts, and people were mobilizing to come and harvest them. Unfortunately, I saw all of this from a moving tour bus and couldn't stop for photographs. Uh, there wasn't even any place where the bus could have pulled over, but it was an entire forest belt uh, just below the subalpine zone that was solid chestnut with just a little bit of mountain maple in the understory. Okay, the next slide is just to point out that chestnut is a part of European culture, and you see it all the time. Uh, Here's a photo of a what they call a castanera, a woman selling roasted chestnuts that is artwork at the entrance gate to the old town of Burgos in northeastern Spain. And then on the lower right is a typical roast chestnut booth in Segovia, Spain. They typically run about €1 per chestnut, but at least they're quite large. But maybe that's just a tourist price, but you can buy little cones of roast chestnuts on the street uh, in most cities in Europe when they're in season. Here's a typical example of a
Hey,
European chestnut that you might see. This is on the grounds of a palace for the Elector of Cologne, not far from the Rhine River, and the surrounding woods were full of healthy looking chestnut trees. Here's one that's actually out from the edge of the forest on the lawn, and you can see the size of the tree and the texture of the bark, and the fact that this was in late June, and you can see how the trees were in full bloom at that time. And the general similarity to American chestnut is pretty obvious. Here's another photo. This was taken from, these are photos taken from a Rhine tour boat and in a tour of the city of Heidelberg. The end of June, and if you look in the forest, you can see that the chestnut in bloom is a significant component of the naturalized forest. All of the crowns of the trees that you see here that are white are European chestnut. And the major companions would be European beech, uh, Durmast oak, and uh, big leaf linden. Now, one interesting issue, especially to a geoscientist, is was chestnut a original component of the wild forest of Europe, or did the Romans introduce it about 4,000 years ago? And that fits into a larger history of what happened to the European forest, because about 2 million years ago, uh, pollen in France and Italy in these deep volcanic crater lakes show that 2 million years ago you had a very rich deciduous forest. In fact, the leading component of pollen is hickory, which of course doesn't exist as a natural tree in Europe at all. The second most common pollen was bald cypress, and during the colder parts of the climate cycle, you had lots of hemlock, all of which are not present in Europe today. The pollen data shows the species flickering out one by one between the 2 million and about 500,000 years ago, getting to a fairly poor forest that's primarily dominated by beech and oak in Germany and France. Now, all of this is related to the solar insolation climate cycle. Us older folks that went to school many years ago thought of the ice ages as kind of a mysterious oscillation that no one understood. And that's not a problem anymore. There's a basic 100-year cycle that ratchets down temperature in about 20,000 year steps. And turns out to be a great way to time what's gone on in the past. And geologists have assigned what we call ocean isotope stages with the odd number ones being warm and the even number ones being cool, going back from number one, which is our present Holocene climate. And for the last couple of million years, you've had nothing but tundra steppe north of the Alps at all of these glacial cold peaks. And the record of castanea pollen in Europe is only seen after about 4,000 years ago, which seems to support the idea that it was the Greeks or the Romans that actually imported it to Europe from the Caucasian region. Here's a nice set of diagrams showing how the forest cycle in Europe looks from, this is from a volcanic crater in France. And we have these multiple cycles going as many as 20 times in the past. And what you see is a transition from frigid and dry at the bottom, where mostly you have pine pollen, a lot of which is blown in. Then the climate becomes warm and dry, so you get birch and oak. And then as it progressively moistens up, you see a stepwise change in the tree cover to include hazel and yew and hornbeam and silver fir, which would act much like hemlock does in our climate, and then into spruce as the climate gets cold and wet, and then back to the cold and dry climate. There are some changes from one cycle to the next. For example, the most recent what's called Eemian warm period, about 120,000 years ago, beech is entirely absent, and you have an especially strong amount of hornbeam and spruce. Whereas in another cycle, this is ocean isotope stage 9, another 100,000 years earlier, you have a lot of yew, and you do have beech coming in. So there is a repeated cycle that does have some changes that are probably more driven by chance than anything else. And the real question is, does chestnut fit in with this or not? And the answer, as far as I can see, is that there is one location in Europe where you can find a believable presence of chestnut pollen during the Eemian, that is 120,000 years ago. And this site is on the northern rim of Spain and consists of little pockets of soil that were trapped underneath collapsing sea cliff faces as they retreated under the impact of waves. So here's the location up in that far northwestern corner of Spain. And the pollen data looks like this. And you can see that in the central warm period, if you can follow my cursor, you see that there is beech. In addition to birch, a substantial amount of beech would imply warm and moist. And there is just a little bit of chestnut pollen, enough to be believable that the tree was there. But that's the extent of it. So the implication is that the chestnut, at least at that time, was able to survive in a refuge in Spain at the base of the Pyrenees, or the western extension of the Pyrenees. So that's the story on chestnut in the past. And the question is whether it really was there, whether it came in by chance now and then, or whether it really had to wait until the Romans would bring it out as an actual crop. But in any case, let's see if I can. In any case, you do see chestnut in the wild in Europe. One of the places I saw it fairly abundant was in the Picos de Europa in northern Spain. These are essentially the western continuation of the Pyrenees along the northern coast of Spain. And the primary forestry there is one of the deciduous oaks, probably Durmast oak, based on the soil type. So that would be Quercus petrea. But unfortunately, much of that landscape is badly degraded. You have these old pastures full of gorse, and then a lot of the woodland is planted eucalyptus trees. So the natural woodland is pretty much beaten back into the ravines and gorges. And when you look in these ravines and gorges, you see that chestnut is there in abundance. And you can see it aggressively seeding in. Here's an example of a tree from the area of Covadonga, who historians would be interested in. That's where the Reconquista officially began, when a group of bandits held off a Muslim force. But this is what it looked like. The trees are bearing nuts. They're alive, but the glass is either half full or half empty. The trees are half alive in their crowns and surrounded by vigorous sprouts, but producing nuts, and lots of chestnuts invading the forest, lots of seedlings. In France, a similar situation. Large trees, as on the right, in pastures, and coppice trees and hedgerows and disturbed areas. Again, you look at the woodlots and you wonder why they haven't all turned to chestnut, because there's so much chestnut seeding into the understory. Now let's see if it's going to. Okay, this is my best representation of the chestnut forest built on Mount Etna. It's a landscape that's got thickly thick cover of coppice chestnut trees, heavily loaded with nuts in September, and you can see more forest in the distance, but lots of fingers of lava flows coming down from the summit. But a densely packed bunch of chestnut coppices with mostly a bracken fern understory, and trees are not exactly pretty. They have a lot of dead branches, and there's a lot of dead wood around, but at the same time, the growth is rampant and the trees are full of nuts. And as sort of an aside, in previous chestnut meetings, we've wondered about what our target for the tree should be when we actually get a finished product. And maybe this is the sort of thing we should be aiming for, is a tree that isn't perfect, but can survive and can exclude competition. And then, as a geoscientist, I'd say let nature take its course. It should be able to evolve back into something like it was at one time, if it has a chance to do its own selective breeding in the wild. But it was refreshing to be able to see a place where the woods are full of chestnut, and they're able to reproduce, and the exuberance with which the locals were coming out with their baskets to pick up the nuts. But my major dealing with European chestnut came through my association as a hydrologist working at Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest. While there, I got to meet a similar team of Russian scientists that were there, and actually contemplating a comparative study of the Hubbard Brook watershed and their watershed in the mountains of the Caucasus. And of course, I quickly latched onto their representation of the forest as being a chestnut forest. And what's interesting is that in the Russian forestry, a tree is a chestnut forest only if it contains nothing but chestnut. So I was wondering, are these pockets of chestnut forest all there is, or is the tree a component of the forest everywhere in the mountains. In any event, I was able to parlay this into an invitation to visit the Russians in their watershed. And they basically said, you know, buy yourself an airplane ticket and we'll pick you up and show you around and take care of you once you're here. There were some glitches, but what I eventually had to do, since no one was there to meet me, I knew that their headquarters were located at Bosim Ulica Karl Marx. Got a cab to take me there, and they picked it up from there. So here's a photo of their headquarters, and the head forester Vladimir at the La Rua forestry station, and what looked a little bit run down, but was nicely embedded in the forest. It turns out that the second time I went there, they were arranging a Vladimir swap, in that their president Vladimir had seen Camp David and decided he needed his own mountain retreat, and he chose this forestry station as his retreat. So this station is no longer there; it's been replaced by a mini palace in the woods. But that was what was there at the time. So where is this? This is the city of Sochi, which is the town where they had the Winter Olympics in 2008, and the Caucasus run right from the shore all the way over to the Caspian Sea, and they are really serious mountains. They're essentially the continuation of the Alpine range from the African European collision. So they look like the Alps, and they feel like the Alps, except that instead of having primarily spruce, they have all deciduous forest. The range of chestnut is actually bimodal. It's located where the moisture is fairly high along the Black Sea, and then again where it gets the moisture sweeping in from the Caspian, with the intermediate area being drier and, at least according to the Russians, free of chestnut. The other question is, do they have blight? And at the time of my visits in 1995 and 2002, there was no blight. And I've since heard from a forest entomologist that was working in Azerbaijan that it appeared in this area in 2008. And so probably has spread throughout the chestnut forests of the Caucasus by now. And it would be interesting to see what the effect has been. Okay, this is what the Caucasus look like. You're looking down on the location, which is now Putin's Camp David, and actually from construction for the ski lift that would be part of his operations there, since he's an avid skier. But you can see what the forest looks like. These are serious alpine mountains with probably about 50% of the area is actually tundra above tree line. So it's really impressive mountains, but also impressive in that instead of seeing chalets and cows and spruce trees, it's this wonderful, diverse, deciduous forest that has almost no conifers and lots of chestnut. Here's a diagram I produced of what the various features look like. The places to note are denoted by E. This is the upper tree line, which is primarily maple and beech. And then this level, this tree line would be about 8,000 feet. And this level here at about 6,000 feet is the upper limit of chestnut. A denotes the hydrologic Lure River station that we were comparing to Covered Book. But this is what the general geometry of the area looks like. What's interesting is that the alpine tundra is about 50% covered with this low ankle-high rhododendron with these creamy white flowers that are really pretty attractive in as the snow retreats. So you have kind of a bathtub ring as you have snow in the pockets, and then brown dead looking foliage, and then as that warms up, the green leaves and creamy flowers look like soap suds. A very interesting and different uh, condition. Here's what the forests look like in mid-July, and you see these light colored crowns. Those are chestnut, but the white color is not flowers. The white color is actually light shine reflecting off of the beginning burrs. When the burrs are very small, they're very shiny and they reflect light. So you see different levels of whiteness, but that gives you an idea of the density of the chestnut in the forest. This is European black alder, a full-size tree-sized alder that grows along the watercourses. These are the numbers that I came up with and how they compare to my colleague Mikhail Pridna's assessment of the forest. I looked at a typical slope, and in terms of stems, it was about 1/4 to 1/3 chestnut. But the chestnut stems were by far the largest trees. So the basal area wise, they are a really major part of the forest. Stem wise, there's a lot of beech and even more hornbeam. In the understory, if you look at the a sort of older reproduction, the advanced reproduction, it's really dominated by beech with a small amount of chestnut. But the interesting aspect of that is that this area had been preserved as a hunting preserve for the communist elite. And so they had ratcheted up the wildlife population so that previous Hubbard Brook foresters that I had talked to said that there was just no tree reproduction at all to be seen. The wildlife had consumed every last acorn and chestnut and beechnut. When I visited, the ground was just covered with new seedlings, but you were seeing an echo of that wildlife abundance with the lack of chestnut advanced reproduction. The other interesting thing was, unless the forest is more than half chestnut, the Russians won't call it chestnut forest. But as far as I could see, chestnut was a component of the forest everywhere, up until its upper altitude limit of about 6,000 feet. Here's one of my favorite photos. This shows a mature chestnut next to a mature beech where a new road construction had opened up the forest. And the similarity to old photographs of American chestnut is really striking. I mean, these trees are ramrod straight, 3 feet in diameter, and reaching for the sky. Quite a thing to see. And the ground is just covered with seedlings. Some of these are a couple years old. Lots of chestnut catkins. The downside is every time you sit down to take a lunch break or something, you end up sitting on or putting your hands on a chestnut burr. So you have to be careful about where you sit in these woods because there are a lot of sharp things down there. Here's an illustration from my notebook showing what a typical one of these seedlings look like. You can see from the growth nodes that they're several years old, but date to the time when the Soviet regime collapsed and the people were starving and they came and ate up all the wildlife. And then I've shown in this picture that the two competitors for chestnut in the understory would be a deciduous azalea and a form of what looks like high bush blueberry. So that was the understory: azalea and blueberry and chestnut and beech. And another illustration of just how many seedlings there could be in this forest, and also how well they competed with the other understory growth. That nut gives them quite a bit of stored energy to get through the understory or get through the competition, and without the wild boars and deer to eat them, the nuts were getting established with wild abandon. Here's a typical tree in the closed forest. Lots of ivy and moss and epiphytes, but you can see from my 9x12 notebook that they're pretty substantial trees. And as far as the Russians say, this is a true virgin forest. It's always been kept as a hunting preserve for the czars and then for the communist elite. Relatively few of the trees were multiple stemmed. They were generally single stemmed, and coppices were just not in the virgin forest. However, they were abundant in areas that have been logged. So the fact that you had so many single stem trees was also sort of an additional support for the idea that this was a true virgin forest. In mid-July, the burrs were just starting to fill out, and you could see them in the overstory. Generally, you had to see them with binoculars, but every now and then along the edge of a road, you could get a better view, like this particular photo. In addition to beech, the other tree that would compete with chestnut would be Durmast oak, and they were generally on the ridge tops. In the lower down on the moisture slopes, the main tree was chestnut, with beech and hornbeam. Another view of the new seedlings as they're being established. I think there's supposed to be an oak seedling here, but I don't see it. One question I had was we know American chestnut generally sprouts from preformed buds that are perched on the root collar, and here's an old dead stump that does show the same sorts of burls that American chestnut sprouts from, but because of the moss cover and everything else, it was really pretty hard to pick these out in photographs. But I think I was seeing the same sort of thing in the trees as shown in my sketch here. And just like chestnut, sometimes these burls actually release a little and start to grow, but that seems to be the same locus for sprouting as we see in American chestnut. And the other thing I've noticed in American chestnut is when you did have blighted trees that were salvaged or harvested, some of their sprouts, even though they were older, did survive, but they generally created their own root system and did not remain attached to the old stump, which is a real disadvantage for some of our oak trees that resprout, in that if their trunk envelops the stump, this is sort of an entry point for disease to get into the heartwood of the surviving tree, whereas chestnut wants to make it its own firm base and get away from this defect here, so that it has a good solid root system. I was able to find very few examples, but here's an area that was logged over where the surviving root collar sprout, and you can see that it is not remained attached to the root system of the original tree. It's got its own set of roots coming in. Finally, my question was, well, how exactly should I represent a slice of this forest. And what I came up with was just a profile of the forest on the slope, showing you how the height and spacing of the various trees was arranged on a typical mountain slope. You can see that the chestnut tend to be bigger, and they often have little mini sprouts attached to the base, whereas the hornbeams are really small. You have some small beaches coming in, and I guess this slide did not reproduce very well, but that gives you a picture of how the forest was set up. Chestnut numerically slightly less than the beech, but visually much more dominant because of their size. And on the same hillside, I tried to document the canopy stems versus the subcanopy advanced reproduction, and then actually looked at the seedlings, ignoring beech completely. And the bar graph gives you an idea of how chestnut was distributed, and you can look at the amount of advanced reproduction, recognizing that beech has had a head start because the wildlife has been really cut back in the last decade. So that's my overall impression of European chestnut in my travels. Wonderful to see the tree in the wild in the Caucasus, and sort of refreshing to see how it's holding forth in the highly disturbed forests of France and Italy and Spain. That it seems to be able to put up with the blight on its own, even though it isn't pretty, and it's aggressively making its way into disturbed woodlots that are essentially all that's left in most of Europe. So that about covers it. None of this was except maybe with the help of my forester friends in the Caucasus, anything scientific, but it was a good way to sample what chestnut is like in the disturbed and in Spain, eucalyptus dominated forest that we have today.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Fred. I always enjoy hearing about your travels. Even I've heard about your Caucasus trip before, and it was fun to hear about it again. We have a few questions in the Q&A, and I would remind folks that if they have questions to add those to the Q&A so we can feed those to Fred and get his opinion on things. And also, a few of you noted early on that we were not in presentation mode for Fred's slideshow. I apologize for that. We had some technical difficulties just getting his slideshow or slides to advance, so we gave up when it would not go into slide presenter mode. Figured it was better to at least see something than just listen to Fred talk with no pictures and no fun field sketches, which is another one of his many skills. So Fred, up to you if you want to leave your pictures up, or you can stop the screen share. We've got a bunch of questions here. I want to start with a couple of basic ones. I think this one actually already got mentioned or answered, but what is the Latin name for European chestnut, for those who are curious?
What's that?
Latin name for European chestnut?
For European chestnut? Castanea sativa.
Thank you. And what are the main differences between dentata and sativa, at least in your observation?
There are some differences in the hairiness of the leaf, but I was surprised at how little difference there really was. I think that the bark is a little more brown on European chestnut in the wild, and but the growth form in the closed forest was similar to what we see in all the old photographs and to what I got to see at West Salem. And let's see if my screen will cooperate with me.
I think I can close it for
I
you.
deliberately chose the slide of the tree by the palace in Cologne as being representative of what a open grown chestnut would look like. And we could compare that to some of the outliers that we see today in places like Iowa and Wisconsin. And yeah, here it is. If it'll make it, yeah, there's the tree. And you can see it's a big sturdy tree. Just like the trees we see grown in the open, it develops a kind of swollen base. If you've seen those pictures from isolated trees out in the open in Wisconsin or Iowa, they tend to have this big cypress-like buttress base that you don't see in the forest grown trees, but you can see it here. And this tree may very well have been carved out of the forest when it was young.
Yeah, and I do a lot of leaf ID as do our other RSCs, and I think European chestnut is always the one that gets me scratching my head the most because it does look the most similar to American chestnut. It has some traits that are more similar and some that are a little bit more similar to the Asian species, and I think phylogenetically it's a little, it's more closely related to the American species, so it all kind of makes sense. But let's see, what else do we have here? Let's see. Barb wants to know, how do the wood properties of sativa compare to dentata? Do you know?
No, I don't know. I don't see how they would be too much different. The old stumps I saw were decaying very similar to American chestnut, and specifically, you'll notice that they tend to decay from the inside out, so that you often end up having a sort of hollow cylinder that, because of the way the wood's structured, breaks into what look like almost boards, just slabs of wood. And I think what's happening is that the heartwood retains moisture because it's plugged up, and so it rots faster than the sapwood, which still has all these open vessels that allow it to drain. And the splitting property of the wood causes the cylinder that's left on the outside to come apart at the seams and look like a bunch of boards when especially when it's lying on the ground and collapses. So based on this evidence, but without ever having used the wood, I have no idea.
Well, it's
And
certainly utilized, right? I mean, they
yeah,
use chestnut wood in Europe. Um, a few questions about chestnut blight in Europe and whether or not European chestnut is susceptible to chestnut blight. My understanding is yes, but it is less so than American chestnut. It's sort of not as resistant as Chinese chestnut, but not as susceptible as American chestnut. But what, in your observation or and study, what would you say about chestnut blight and its impact on European chestnut?
well, I've seen blighted trees. Probably the thing that strikes me the most is they aren't being girdled at the base. They're sort of they seem to die back from the crown, and I don't know exactly how whether the crown loss is responding to what's going on lower down in the trunk. And if you see, uh, especially here and when I'm looking at Ozark chinkapin, which is also more resistant, uh, when they start to die from blight, you'll often see the top sort of wither, but the lower branches keep on going for a while. And so that may be what's happening with the European, is that the blight is in the bark, and the bark is losing its transmission abilities, and so the tree dies back, uh, generates new sprouts on the base, but keeps on trucking.
Great. Let's see. Okay, well, Mike has a question kind of related to sprouts. Let's see if this is a good segue here. You saw lots of trees with mini sprouts around the root collar. Was this in forests not impacted by blight? And so would you say that chestnut will produce root collar sprouts in the absence of blight?
Yeah, we saw that at West Salem. There were some trees that, especially on drier sites, that had what almost looked like little bonsais just perched on their trunk. Perfectly healthy uh, canopy trees, and they've got these little slow growing little uh, heavily suppressed branches coming off the top of the trunk. And in my work with Ozark chinkapin, that seems to be almost universal. When I autopsy blight killed trees here in the late 50s, you see this single dominant trunk that could be 2 feet in diameter, and then all around the base are these little slow growing stems. They aren't real coppices, and it's not clear what the purpose of these things are. And if you cross section them, they may have 20 or 30 years of growth. They're extremely slow growing, but there they are. And I don't know who's seen this, but I've actually tried to reconstruct what I think is the best representation of an old growth Ozark chinkapin. And the two trees that I've fleshed out, about 70 feet tall on a dry ridge, a single stem, but quite crooked. And then these little basal stems just sort of hanging around there. And that seems to have been the natural growth form.
Interesting. Well, since we're talking about sprouts and you already jumped species talking about chinkapin,
Right.
or it was our chinkapin, Clark was actually curious if you knew if do American chestnuts root sprouts make their own new root system and not utilize the stump's root system?
That's what I'm saying. Now, again, autopsying dead trees. And I think one thing that the lesson that comes through loud and clear is that if a dead chestnut is just left alone, it will fall over as the roots rot out, and that will rip all of the root sprouts out of the ground with it. Whereas if you salvage the wood and cut the tree down and leave the stump in the ground, a number of those that I autopsied in Massachusetts years ago still had live sprouts. And the live sprouts, when they were heavily suppressed, looked like seedlings, except for the fact that they're right next to a fully dead stump. You'd never think that they were somehow attached to it.
Great. Sorry, I'm looking through this to see if we can find
Yeah.
some fun ones that are related. Actually, before I get to some more questions in the Q&A, there were a couple things that came up kind of more so in the chat, but there were a few comments on the lack of deer. And I think you kind of alluded to some overhunting that may have been happening in that area, but what can you say about the deer population in Europe versus here?
I imagine it varies. There's some places where red deer is are a real problem. And of course there's still livestock. And in Spain and France, where I got a chance to look at rural woodlands, my first impression was chestnut is really invasive. You've got woods that are probably grazed sometimes, but not others. And generally the landscape, as everybody moves to the city, is being slowly abandoned. That chestnut, at least in the short term, is quite invasive. But as things progress and these rural areas become more rural and the deer move back in, it's going to have the opposite effect. Now, when Phil and I looked at the forest in West Salem before blight, just before blight really took over, that's one thing we noticed dramatically was that fence lines separated chestnut reproduction from no chestnut reproduction based on livestock use. So there was no question but that livestock like chestnut even more than oak and anything else.
Yeah, I think pretty much everything likes to eat chestnuts.
Yeah.
It's like planting candy bars. You mentioned France and and more, kind of that part of Europe and spending some time there. Did you ever see much hypervirulence and sort of the impact that has on European chestnut in kind of more south
No, I
central?
didn't see much evidence of hypervirulence. Although I saw trees that were surviving, and I have no way of knowing how they were doing that. So it may very well be that hypervirulence accounts for what's going on Mount Etna and what I saw in damaged trees that were still producing nut crops.
Hmm. Yeah, Doug was
And
wondering if there is hypervirulence in Europe where the
I'm
chestnuts seem to be surviving
pretty
well. And I
sure
think,
there is. I mean,
yeah,
it's been well documented.
yeah, that's where it came from, or at least that's where
Yeah.
it was first documented. It was in France, right? Um, let's see. Oh, I saw one kind of fun one for you that is, uh, um, not as related to the European chestnut stuff, but more to your field sketches. Did you happen to sketch the leaf that is TACF's logo? I know you did the leaf ID cards,
Yeah.
but someone was curious if that was also your handiwork.
No.
Nope.
No.
All right. I do like those ID cards I've used for forever. I don't think we haven't
Yeah.
printed them in a while, but they're very handy. Um, let's see. Narul is curious if there are European chestnuts growing here in the US, and if so, how they survive with blight. I mean, I know they're planted as a nut crop in certain areas and as hybrids. Do you know much more about them, Fred?
No, I don't, and I don't know. I've seen the famous sleeping giant plot that the Connecticut Ag Station had, and I don't. Well, I think all I saw there were Chinese and Japanese, and
Yeah. So, in my understanding, or at least most of what I've seen for European chestnuts planted in the US have been for nut production. There's a lot of European Japanese hybrids that are planted by some of the nut growing cooperatives. And then there are some nut producers, particularly on the West Coast, that plant European varieties. They have a quarantine for chestnut on the West Coast so that those trees are growing in the absence of blight, at least so far, thankfully. There was another question about the degree of resistance to blight. I think we kind of covered this already, but European chestnut is moderately resistant to blight. It's not as resistant as Chinese or American chestnut, but it's not as susceptible as American chestnut. Of the chestnut species, I would say it is one of the less cold hardy. American chestnuts do really well where I am in Vermont. Chinese chestnuts still generally do okay. They're a little less cold tolerant. European chestnuts generally will just winter kill. I've got a few folks up here who've been trying to grow them because they would really like to have European chestnuts to eat. And they are not as cold tolerant as the other species. I'm not sure about how they compare with Japanese chestnut. I don't know if you have a sense of that, Fred.
yeah, all I can say is that the upper altitude limit was about 8,000 feet in the Caucasus, and I suppose it might be of interest if the Russians will still cooperate with us to try and get some trees, some seed or material from trees at the higher elevational limit of the tree in the Caucasus.
Vinny, speaking of the, kind of the forest, get back to the forest in the Caucasus, Vinny was wondering what do you think is the cause of the deciduous trees dominating and having very few conifers in that forest type?
I think the main reason is that it's hasn't been disturbed. Uh, if you've been to Switzerland, uh, there's a lot of spruce trees, but if you go to fairly wild areas, it's actually dominated by beech with some oak and hornbeam and ash. And uh, what's interesting to note is that if you look at Britain today, the pre uh, historic original forest was actually almost entirely linden, what we would call basswood, and that the tree of basswood is very difficult to reproduce and has pretty much been eradicated from the forest. Uh, you can identify ancient hedgerows by the fact that they might still have some linden in them. But I think part of the problem is the human beings have been around ever since the climate changed in the alpine environment. And I was really disappointed my first time when I went to the Alps to see it's spruce trees, cows, and grass, and finally found this one little preserved natural area where they had excluded livestock and wildlife, and it was this beautiful wildflower meadow with Swiss stone pine coming in and surrounded by this denuded pasture grazed right to the grassroots. So I think part of the problem with the Alps is that spruce is a very good timber crop tree, and it's been allowed to take over.
Well, I know this is a little off topic, but I feel like we have time.
Yeah.
You mentioned the lindens. I recall, so Fred, you also joined a trip to China to look at Chinese chestnut in its quote native habitat with
Right.
a few other scientists from our organization back in what, maybe 09, 2010, maybe earlier. I don't know. It was a while ago.
It was 08.
08? Oh goodness. Okay, yeah, it was a long
September
time ago.
08. Yeah.
But I remember one of Sarah's observations coming back was that there were a lot of similar species in the forest types in China where you guys were finding chestnut, sort of like the Asian counterparts to a lot of the Central Appalachian forest species that we find along with chestnut. Thoughts on that?
So you want me to name the trees that we saw?
I guess I was just curious if that was your observation as well. That it, kind of across the range of where we see chestnut trees, they kind of tend to form these similar relationships.
The amount of disturbance was just incredible. A lot of these forests have been planted with Japanese larch, and there was a native Chinese white pine that was not native to the area that had been spread around quite a bit. There was a kind of a serrated leaf white oak. There was some tulip poplar, and there was even a little bit of hemlock. A lot of what looked very much like our black sweet birch. A lot of that, and a kind of cherry that was roughly analogous to black cherry. The bark wasn't quite as scaly, but grows similar. And then quite a bit of beech in places. So oak, beech, birch, cherry, and some magnolia. So it had a similar look to it. Actually, and the forest in the Caucasus had a very similar look to our Appalachians. And I think that the most disconcerting point was you'd sit down there on a hillside and it would sound like you were in the Appalachians. There's all these warblers overhead chattering, but they have the songs wrong. They just aren't singing the same phrase. So
Awesome.
it, but the
Oh,
amount
go
of
ahead.
disturbance in China was just, to seeing that much disturbance, and really strange things like instead of kudzu, they had trees being overwhelmed by kiwi fruit, which I never would have thought to see. There's this giant knit with kiwi fruit strangling everything, and with
Interesting.
the kiwi fruits just too high to reach.
Well, maybe that's getting the birds singing.
And,
All right, back to Europe. We did have a question from Ron. He was wondering if you know, are there any ecological studies on the Mount Etna forest that have been done or you're aware of?
I looked online, and I know that when I was traveling there, they referred to the chestnut forest belt on Mount Etna, but I could find nothing on that online. But it's something that really needs to be looked into, because this is, as the roadblocks keep cropping up in the chestnut breeding story, this is a short-term goal we might consider to aim at, is just getting a population in the wild that can sustain itself and find its way on its own.
Well, we better than what we have now, right?
Yeah.
Well, kind of related to that, Brooke is wondering if you can you tell us more about the amount of infection, cankers, and dead branches you observed that chestnut trees were able to survive with? We hear much about the ability of the species to survive with the blight. I'm wondering what it looks like in a forest with a surviving chestnut component. So I guess like what would that marginal survival look like?
Well, I think it would look like what we're seeing on Mount Etna, is these vigorous coppices of chestnut, uh, with some dead branches in the top, and a dead trunk or two still sticking up, but uh, first dominating. There's virtually nothing else in the woodlot, but some smaller mountain maples, some canopy tree, and and they can exclude any of the other trees that are around there. The other forest types are oak and pine at lower elevation, and birch and beech and aspen at higher elevations. And there's this belt of just chestnut that fills the intermediate area. And of course, it's south of the Alps, so whether chestnut has been there all along, or whether it had to be brought in by the Romans, uh, is a question. Of course, there's no good pollen sites that anyone knows of that can look at the past history.
Um, awesome. Well, speaking of past history, Clark is curious if you've ever seen the 100 Night chestnut tree in Italy. The story is the king and the queen and 100 knights sheltered under the tree during a storm. I've heard of this. Is it the 100 Knights or something? It's something like that. Do you know what he's talking about?
Now, I haven't heard that, but there's an old ecologist named Oliver Rackham, who has written volumes on the ancient forests of Britain. And the book that I have has some ancient trees, one or two of which are chestnuts, and they're giant coppices. They're ancient trees, but they're essentially a circle of old, tortured, convoluted trunks that uh, may have been there for thousands of years.
Yeah. Yeah, I just looked it up. It's the 100 Horses chestnut, which I think is the
Yeah.
100 Knights part. Um, and there were a few comments earlier about coppicing in Europe, and I think that's a much more common practice. Is that something you saw much of in your travels, or that you know much more about?
No, I saw coppice chestnuts, especially in hedgerows in France. Whether they were deliberately coppiced or not, I don't know. And and all of my experience in France is really confined to Brittany, where I had a faculty position there for a semester. So I didn't, my rest of my travels through France were somewhat limited, but I did see a lot of coppice, and just like in parts of America, there's people are moving to the cities, and the farms are being abandoned or less intensely farmed,
Hmm.
and so you just see that there's chestnuts along a fence row, and they're coppiced in the big trees, and the one thing I did note was the trees in the Caucasus were producing chestnuts about the size of American chestnuts, whereas the ones you buy on the street are humongous. And I mean, that's why one of the reasons why they cost €1 each, but they're obviously a special cultivar and not the wild variety.
Oh, interesting. I didn't realize there was such a variety in sizes. I just kind of assumed all European chestnuts were like this big.
Yeah, the ones in the Caucasus, at least based on the burrs and the nutshells I was seeing, were obviously closer to American and not these uh, things as big as ping pong balls and
Yep. Um, here's a question. I don't know if you're gonna know the answer to this, but I can comment on it if you're not sure. Tom is wondering if the genetics from either Melissima or Sativa could be used towards Phytophthora resistant chestnuts.
I have no idea, but it's certainly worth pursuing.
Yeah, I think my understanding is that European chestnut is also susceptible to Phytophthora cinnamomi. Did you find, or are you familiar with that one, Fred?
No, not at all. And
Okay. I'm pretty sure they're both that species is
yeah,
susceptible. Chinese chestnut is not, and we are utilizing genes from Chinese chestnut to develop resistant, Phytophthora resistant trees. So that's kind of underway. Um, let's see. Oh, someone gave us a fun fact about the chestnut of the 100 horses. It's about 3,000 years old. It's from Sicily and was voted Tree of the Year. It came in fourth place, according to Google. So thank you, anonymous attendee, for that fun fact. I did also put a link in the chat to the Wikipedia page for the 100 horse chestnut, if anyone is curious to see some sketches of a very massive coppiced tree. Let's see. Oh, another just a fun comment from Barb. She mentioned that a Wisconsin forester told her that if it weren't for blight, American chestnut would be considered an invasive, if desirable, species.
yes.
If only, right? I actually, one of my first conferences when I was finishing grad school, I presented like, a very small, like, I don't know, it was a flash talk or what, at a ecological society conference or something like that in Chattanooga. And the one person who had a question for me stood up and was like, "Why would you even want to restore American chestnuts? They're a weed." I was like, "Oh, well, there's a bunch of us who don't actually think it's a bad thing to bring back a species that humans caused to disappear." Um, do you know if there's any work on transgenic chestnuts in Europe? You
Not
were there
the
quite a while ago.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, certainly. In the last 10 years, all of my time in Europe has been strictly as a tourist.
yeah. My understanding is that for like in general, the acceptance and interest in those technologies in Europe is a little less than it is here in the US, but I'm not
Yeah.
aware of any particular work on blight resistance from a genetic standpoint or from a transgenic standpoint in Europe. Um, Not related to Europe, American chestnut, but Edward had asked this question really early on, and since we have time, I want to get to it. Do you know what happened to European hickory that was prominent 2 million years ago? Do you know why it died out?
But it died out because it couldn't exist on north of the Alps, and during the coldest times and couldn't come back out. And lots of other trees had the same problem. It was just a question of how many cycles they could somehow find a way to get through. So things like sweet gum and black gum and bald cypress and hemlock just stopped being there after one or two or three or four of these 100,000-year cycles. Now, as an aside, in North America, we've always recognized that we don't have any pollen profiles that go back beyond about 15,000 years to the previous interglacial. But that's not true anymore. There is one pollen record that goes back 130,000 years from Piedmont, Virginia. And it does show how different the forest has been in North America most of the time, because much of the pollen looks like southern Manitoba all the way through. The last interglacial ends with a northern hardwoods forest coming in, and then it warms up a bit, and then when it's probably getting drier all the time, and then from then on it's all jack pine and black spruce. And what's interesting is there's no chestnut or beech in any of this. After the northern hardwoods end, beech is gone and stays gone. And,
Neat.
but it's only one location, one sample, but at least it's interesting to be able to look back to the last time 120,000 years ago when the climate was the same as the modern climate.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. I mean, I think it's hard for us as humans to really even like conceptualize that. I mean, even just
Right.
like my property, I know was a cleared farm at one point because there's apple trees in the middle of the woods that have no business being there, and there's rock walls. But like even thinking about it looking that different, and that's just a short, that's a couple generations,
Right.
that far back is just, yeah, it's very cool.
Yeah.
I will say, so Steve Jeffers is on here. Steve, thank you so much. He confirmed European chestnut is very susceptible to Phytophthora cinnamomi. So we have the answer to that.
Yeah.
If anyone would know, Steve works with Phytophthora at Clemson. So thanks for confirming that, Steve. We got it from a good source. Let's see. An anonymous attendee asks, or if Caucasus European chestnuts produce nuts, why didn't that happen with blight affected American chestnuts?
Well, I imagine it would happen if they stayed alive.
Yeah.
And they had a pollinating partner. A lot of coppice chestnuts that manage to evade the blight produce flowers. They just don't have any partner to help them pollinate. But
Yeah.
I have to admit that in the areas that I still look at in Connecticut when I visit home, I'm actually seeing chestnut reproduction. Not very much, but you see these blighted trees, probably with some hypervirulence, that manage to get big enough to produce a small crop of nuts before they give up the ghost and go back to basal sprouts. So Americans can too if they get the chance.
Yeah. But we found a few stands here and there that are reproducing, but it is pretty few and far between. Is that in Northwest Connecticut, Fred?
No, I grew up in New Haven, so it's in a
Oh, okay.
state forest that surround New Haven.
Okay, cool. Oh, and so I think we're just about to wrap here. So we answered that. Hal put a nice link if anyone's curious in the Q&A about another cool big chestnut in Spain. And check that out if you want it. Let me see if I can pull this out and put it in the chat for everyone. There we go. Maybe. There, that's for everyone to enjoy. You mentioned New Haven. I feel like that's an opportunity for a plug. Our annual meeting this year is going to be at the end of October. We haven't, I don't think we've published the dates, but it's like the 24th, 25th, whatever that Friday is. And so that's going to be in Cromwell, Connecticut, but we're hoping to have a nice, fun field day. So yeah, October 25th, 26th, 27th. We're going to be going to the Connecticut Ag Station. We're hoping for some field tours on Sunday. And if you ever want to see different chestnut species all in one place and a wide variety of hybrids, they have a really cool collection of chestnut trees there. Definitely some European chestnut in their collection. All kinds of cool things to check out. So stay tuned for that. Other than that, I think we got to all the questions. Fred, thank you so much. It's always so exciting and fun to hear about your chestnut travels, and I always enjoy your field sketches. I still have one from taking you out to the Berlin site that I think is quite lovely. And just a few more reminders for folks. Again, we're off next week, or not next week, next month. We are going to take a break in the month of June while our field staff are all out running around doing field things. And but we are really excited for our 50th Chestnut Chat in July. I promise Sarah will host that. It will not be me filling in for our 50th, but we'll find some fun ways to commemorate that momentous occasion. So stay tuned for more details, and thank you again.
All right, glad to do it.
All right. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Fred. And for everyone else, have a great rest of your day. Happy weekend, and have fun getting out playing with chestnuts now that it's the field season. Take care.